Well, Glenn, thank you very much for that introduction, and it's good to follow Ted, because I was at the CQC for just under 3 years, I think, and I think what the CQC have done since I left has been fantastic, and you're carrying on a great job there, Ted, so well done. I wanted to start off today by really starting off with, you could call the sort of the bleeding obvious, if you like, but it's the bleeding obvious, but also, I think, it is also very remarkable. And that's that after 70 years, the need for the NHS in the UK, in England, has never been clearer or more necessary. And I say that because I was very influenced by a book I read recently called Jamestown, which is about a small or medium-sized town in Wisconsin in America, which was the town where the first General Motors plant was built right at the end of the 1920s and into the 1930s. And it was the biggest employer in Jamestown, and all the suppliers to GM were in Jamestown as well. And when that plant closed about 5 years ago, because of Japanese and Chinese competition, that town never recovered. And in a way, that town is a metaphor for what has happened in large parts of the US, and explains in large part why populism and Donald Trump is now the president of the US. And I thought the same thing again when I went up to Teesside a couple of weeks ago. I used to work at British Steel during the 1980s. And you can stand in one place on Teesside, and you can look out over the old British Steel plant that used to employ 15,000 blue-collar, proud, well-paid people, and look out just a few miles further over and the old ICI Wilton plant that at its heyday employed 30,000 predominantly blue-collar male employees, all earning today, I guess, if they were still working there, would be earning sort of £30 an hour, that kind of a job, good jobs, good, solid, proud, working-class families. So between British Steel and ICI in that plant, probably 50,000 people, something like that, with all their dependents. Now on those two sites combined, I think there are 2,500 people working. Most of those other people will be working probably on minimum wage somewhere in the system. We have high employment levels in the UK, as we know, but we have very low wage rates as well. So when David Cameron said in 2010, at the time austerity was blowing in after the financial crisis, that we're all in it together, I did think about those people who were working on Teesside and people who worked in Jamestown and people who worked across the whole of Europe, if you like. Do we really think that we're all in it together? I don't think we have been. And in a way, the NHS stands almost alone as the institution where we are all in it together. It is a single gene. It doesn't matter what your genes are when you're born, how rich you are, how poor you are, where you are in the system. We are all in it together. There's a book called The Road to Somewhere by David Goodhart that some of you may have read. Probably the most insightful analysis. He worked for Gordon Brown, and probably one of the most insightful analyses of why people voted one way or the other on the Brexit issue, or whether they voted for Donald Trump or not, or whether they vote for populist parties in Europe. And the anywheres are people, by and large, who are educated at university. They tend to be young, they tend to be mobile, they tend to live in big cities, they tend to work away from home. And the somewheres are people who didn't have university education, who tend to be born, to work, and to die within 10 miles of each other. And in a way, I see the NHS probably as our most powerful bridge between anywheres and somewheres, because there has been an enormous gulf that has opened up over the last sort of 5-10 years between, if you like, the somewheres and the anywheres. And I think not only has the NHS been a bridge, a sort of a societal bridge, but actually, by and large, it has delivered pretty good healthcare. Maybe not the best in the world in all specialties, but on the whole, pretty good healthcare. I mean, it's pretty remarkable, isn't it, that probably the two best-known American healthcare institutions, the Mayo Clinic and the Cleveland Clinic, have both in the last 2 years decided to open up big new operations in London. And they've come to London, although one of them is also going to be based in Oxford, because actually we do have some of the best clinicians and some of the best facilities here in the world. It's interesting, isn't it, that if you look at immunotherapies as being one area of clinical practice, which is right at the cutting edge of cancer treatment, that is actually here at UCL and King's, where those new therapies have largely been developed. So if we look then at how we've chosen to spend our money in the NHS over the last sort of 20 years. Throughout that time, I joined the NHS in 2001, and this is, I think, remarkable that there is an extraordinary degree of political consensus around this. Of course, we're always going to fight around the margins, but actually at the heart of it, if you were to put Philip Hunt and myself in a room or in a separate room and we were to talk about the NHS, the differences between us would be tiny compared to the agreements that we would have. We've had the provider-purchaser split really since the 1990s. We've lived with that right the way through the last 30 years. We moved in the early 2000s with New Labour to targets, access targets, but also targets for things like MRSA. Very top-down, you can say politically driven targets, but actually those targets were chosen politically because they were what the public wanted. We then moved to choice and competition. We had foundation trusts and ISTCs and greater encouragement for patients to move from one hospital to another. And then we moved to regulation with a beefed up CQC and with a growing role for the NHS improvement, incorporating monitor. And what all those drivers for improvement did was to deliver a pretty good service. A pretty good service. Not the best service, but a pretty good service. I think they failed in large measure to drive out unwarranted variation. In a way, if the competition and choice had worked, as it works in many parts of the private sector, unwarranted variation is absolutely driven out. You cannot survive in the retail world with unwarranted variation, but we do have a lot still within the NHS. But what it also did, at a time when the population was getting older and requiring a different kind of care to the kind of care that the population needed in 1948 when the NHS was set up, was that it fragmented the system and it disintegrated the system. In a way, foundation trusts were the poster child for that. You know, we got, 150 pretty independent sovereign states within our healthcare system. No obligation to work outside the hospital gates. In fact, every incentive to draw as much business into those hospitals as they could. We've had silos develop. I think we'd all accept that there have been suboptimal patient pathways, that people who ought to have been treated at home or outside in community hospitals or in primary care have been treated increasingly in acute hospitals. But I think in a way, looking back over that 20 years, the most damaging, and I put this in the context that overall it's been a success, but the most damaging byproduct of that move to targets and choice and competition and regulation has been that it's affected very poorly the culture that we operate and live in within the NHS. I remember coming into the NHS, my whole life before that had been in the private sector, being absolutely staggered by the way that we treated ourselves. That very top-down, brutal performance management, which would have been unacceptable in most private companies. And Ted talked about the blame culture. I guess it was, to me, in the sort of early, in the 2000s, when we've had to hit those targets, the degree of pressure put on management to hit those targets was unconscionable. And it unquestionably drove divisions between managers and clinicians. It drove huge pressures between primary care and acute care, between GPs and acute physicians. So I think the culture of the organisation was very adversely affected over that time, which is not to say, of course, that within parts of the NHS, the culture is fantastic. there are many, many people who still go the extra mile within the NHS. But we've gone, if I could sort of encapsulate it this way, we've almost gone from a culture, maybe I'm looking back in rose-tinted glasses to some extent, but a culture based on trust to one that's more based on contract. So the move towards integration, which I think Matthew Swindells would have talked about yesterday, is an attempt to put the NHS back together again, if you like. It's going to have much more of a focus on population health. It's going to be much more of a focus on out-of-hospital care. And what's really struck me about where it's working, where integrated care systems are coming together, a much greater focus on the social determinants of healthcare. Because in a way, the area where I think we have delivered the least in the NHS, which is sort of counterintuitive given the equity that stands at the heart of the NHS, is around health inequalities. What is truly remarkable to me is that the degree of health inequality is no better in the UK than it is in America or Germany or France or anywhere else. Basically, if you are poor and you come from a deprived background, you will die 10 years before people from better backgrounds, and you will have 20 years less good, healthy life. And that is true in Chicago, it is true in London, it is true in Glasgow. And we have not addressed that issue to anything like the degree that we should have done in England. And it is my hope that the integrated care systems will address that issue. And actually, going to Manchester, going to Tyneside, going to Surrey Heartlands the other day, there are real signs that local people are coming together. And it's not just social care and healthcare coming together. It's education, it's housing, it's the whole of the public sector. Because integrated care systems are not going to solve on their own or at all the affordability issue. There's no evidence at all from around the world that integrated care systems save money. On the contrary, I think that integrated care systems will reveal a level of unmet need in parts of the population, which, other things being equal, will cost more money. So if we look a little bit about affordability, Simon Stevens negotiated approximately a 3.5% real increase per annum for the next 5 years, which is a remarkable increase compared to what other parts of the public sector will receive. But it's even more remarkable when you compare it with what the likely level of economic growth in this country is going to be over the next 5 years. I mean, most commentators now would reckon that economic growth is going to be nearer 1% than 2%, probably somewhere between 1 and 1.5%. Well, if you think that healthcare today is taking, 10, 11% of GMP, if the growth in the health budget is 3.5% over the next 5 years per annum, and growth is around 1.5%, the percentage that the healthcare will take of the national economy is going to be closer to 15% than 10%. So I think we are right at the further edge of affordability, and that will be true, I think, whichever government is in power. I think going back to the Treasury for more money over this period of time is just not going to be possible. So how are we going to live within this? I think, firstly, improvement. We should talk about improvement a bit more. And I talk about improvement as distinct from regulation. I think regulation can reinforce improvement, but actually improvement, I think, requires a different approach, a sort of a different culture. And I think the GS1 standards are a very important part of driving that sort of operational improvements through the system, not just on safety, but also operational efficiency. I think that getting it right first time, the GIRFT initiative led by Professor Tim Briggs is another very important part of that, how we drive out unwarranted variation from the system. I think we're going to see a complete new look at how we manage outpatients. It is extraordinary as a a patient going into a fracture clinic or an eye clinic or indeed any outpatients clinic, is like stepping back 30 years still. I think we'll see far more cold surgical sites. It's almost impossible to run a really efficient orthopedic unit, elective orthopedic unit, within a busy hospital. I mean, I'm sure it can be done, but it's incredibly difficult. I mean, I went round most recently, I suppose, the UCLH theatre complex. Incredibly difficult to drive real efficiencies through those theatres. The number of times you come into a busy hospital and you find the orthopedic surgeons and indeed other surgeons and the anaesthetists and all the theatre staff hanging around drinking coffee because they cannot get into theatre because the beds are occupied in the hospital. It is very hard to run that. Now, of course, we can run it better, no doubt, within our existing hospital structure. But I think we will see a move to more cold surgical sites. I'm very interested, for example, in the new orthopedic theatre complex at Guy's, which is largely set up by Johnson & Johnson. Running it with J&J or Stryker, whoever it happens to be, I think could be very interesting. We'll see a lot more robotic surgery. If we can get hips and knees down to day surgery, routine day surgery, that'll make a huge difference, and I'm absolutely sure that's coming. And well, of course, I think we'll see huge potential savings still in the way that we purchase our supply chain and the way we use our property. We need, I think, roughly a 2% productivity improvement per annum over the next 5 years if we're going to live within our budgets and free up some resource for transformation. Now, we've achieved that sort of 2%, sort of just around 2% over the last 5 years. To achieve that 2% over the next 5 years is actually a tough ask. But we do need to get that kind of level of productivity improvement over that time. And that will require, I think, a decent capital settlement later on this year. It's very hard to drive productivity if you don't have a decent level of capital investment going on at the same time. But I can see 3 other areas where I think healthcare is going to change very fundamentally over the next 5 and certainly over the next 10 years, which I think could help us achieve a greater sort of comfort around affordability. The first, of course, is digital. And I think, again, Matthew and others would have talked to you about this in more detail yesterday. If you just stand back and look and see how digital technology has changed the banking industry, how it has changed the retail industry, how it's changed every other industry, it is a phenomenal change. And we are just in the foothills in the NHS. We still don't have electronic patient records in many of our hospitals. This could have a dramatic and fundamental change to the way we deliver healthcare. The NHS app has just been delivered, but I mean telemedicine. Already, pharmacy to you. You can get your repeat medication prescriptions delivered straight to your house through the post. Wearables, sensors enable many, many more people to be managed properly at home. Much more people will be doing their own diagnostics at home. A much more joined up system. So I think digital technologies are going to have a huge impact. The second is science. We have always been in the UK the leader in genomics. We've now delivered the 100,000 genome program. If we can bring together your genomic data with your phenotype data, we will have a much better, we'll be much more able to deliver true personalized prevention and personalized medicine. If we can use some of these new technologies to diagnose cancer, for example, much earlier. The Grail are now doing this new trial with UCL. I think it's 30,000 people trying to identify circulating tumor DNA, to identify cancer many years before it becomes symptomatic. And it's the bringing together of the phenotype and the genotype and the use of artificial intelligence to interpret that data is, I think, a complete game changer, and the UK is right at the leading edge of this. And the NHS, because it's the single biggest single payer system in the world, has probably got better data on which to deliver these new algorithms than any other system in the world. So I think there is a huge opportunity going forward to deliver world-class healthcare at an affordable level in the UK. And I think it may just be by chance that actually the NHS is the best positioned healthcare system to do that, as well as remaining, I think, the most important part of in the way that we bridge our society together. Thank you.